This video is now in session, and today we're going to talk about the Israeli and Palestinian conflict. So this is a very complex conflict and one that requires a lot of intricacies, so let's get straight down to it. Now, in terms of the context of this conflict that's currently going on between Israel and Palestine, this has been brewing for several months, with Israel relocating and dislocating Arabs within its community and forcefully moving them out to lower income places of Israel and less well-known places of Israel, or to the east of Jerusalem, where Palestine currently holds some land. And that started the snowball that went to this conflict. And it all came toppling with two events that have happened in the past week. A few days ago, Israel evicted six Arab families from their homes, and they dislocated them. And that riled a lot of Arab individuals within Israel. The second event was the forceful moving out of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is the third holiest site for Islam and for those who practice Islam. And this is currently, or it was, the week of Ramadan for a lot of Arabs, and the Israeli officials knew this, and they forcefully moved out Arab prayers in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. That event, plus the eviction of six Arab families, led to this issue, and from there, the Hamas, which is a military group located in Palestine, more specifically the Gaza Strip, started launching airstrikes against Israel in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem, which obviously escalated the conflict. And from there, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu upped the ante by firing back, by literally sending air missiles back to the Gaza Strip and against the Hamas. And this has escalated even further. The tensions have heightened even further. With last night, Israeli military announced that no one in the Israeli military can go on leave, so they had to be on duty. And not only that, but they also stormed the Gaza Strip. So currently, Israeli troops are now in Gaza, and we don't quite know what they're doing, but there are two likely possibilities that Israeli officials are doing in Gaza, which is, first, is trying to disarm the Hamas of its weapons and its artillery by seizing the rockets and seizing the weapons that enable them to attack Israel. The second and more malicious reason could be that Israel wants to launch a full-out attack against the Gaza Strip and to attack Palestinians living in Gaza. Obviously, the second one is much more malevolent, but those two are the likeliest possibilities in this conflict. So now we have established the context of this. What are the reactions to this? In terms of reactions, let's start with the Palestinian side. The Palestinian side, the Hamas, and as well as other Palestinians, have been crying for an end to Israel's policies against Arabs and the discrimination against those who practice Islam in Israel, because there are Arab settlers in Israel. There are those who practice Islam inside of Israel. It's not completely defined by the armistice boundary established several decades ago. And what Palestinians are essentially saying is they want a voice in this issue. They want to have the opportunity to have part of the sacred site of Jerusalem, which is held by both Judaism and Islam, and as a result, they deserve the right to at least be able to go to Jerusalem safely without having to be forcefully moved out of Jerusalem and to have their religious sites closed down. Meanwhile, on the Israeli side, the reactions to this are somewhat political, somewhat for the sake of trying to disarm the Palestinians. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that he vowed to bring an iron fist against Palestine and to disarm Palestine from their weapons. And that's exactly what he's trying to do. Netanyahu is trying to send a message against Palestine, which is that they still ultimately do not have a voice in this issue. Now, transferring this more internationally and more globally, we see that for the United Nations, they are fearing and they are launching press releases that are fearing of a war between Jerusalem and between Tel Aviv as well as Gaza, which is obviously the least favorable option for both of those nations. And then going more nationally, in other countries, most countries are not expressing solidarity for either party, for either Israel or Palestine, but instead they're calling for peace. And that's essentially what Joe Biden in the United States has also done. That said, what separates the United States in this instance from other countries is that the United States does not want to get involved in this situation. Joe Biden does not want to get involved because he wants to focus on domestic issues rather than this specific issue, and somewhat rightfully so, because we've seen the U.S. tamper in these kinds of issues before between Palestine and Israel, and it leads to literally nothing and no progress. We saw before with Bill Clinton that he tried to establish peace between Palestine and Israel, and while he was somewhat successful, ultimately a lot of his legacy in this area has been erased by these recent events. And continuing further, there hasn't really been a true establishment of peace between between Tel Aviv and Gaza. So those are all the reactions to this event. Now, I mentioned earlier that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said he vowed to bring an iron fist, and he is essentially trying to start a war, or trying to start a war in the most subtle way possible against Palestine. And that may seem incredibly detrimental to him and his political future, but unfortunately, very unfortunately, these days, leaders are incentivized to go into war. They are incentivized to start conflicts with other nations, and this has essentially been most of history. If we look at past precedent, we see that when war starts, a nation will coalesce around its leader. It will rally around its leader. And we see this with the Falkland Wars that happened between Argentina and Great Britain, where the United Kingdom rallied around Margaret Thatcher, the former conservative prime minister of the United Kingdom. We see in World War II with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, where many people coalesced around him. Many Americans coalesced around him in World War II. The same thing with Winston Churchill. The same thing with Ronald Reagan in the Cold War. So all of these past precedents translates over to today, where Benjamin Netanyahu recognizes this, and as a result, by starting this conflict and by escalating it, he hopes to bring Israel under Israelians to rally for him. And that's important because of the elections that Israel has been holding for several years at this point. So this has to bring more context into the situation, which is that Israel has a legislative branch kind of similar to like the British Parliament, or if you're in the United States, the US Capitol, which is called the Knesset. So the Knesset runs like much of a normal parliament. You need a simple majority in order to get stuff passed. But in this specific instance, in Israel's instance, it works a little bit differently in one case. Israeli law dictates that once a Knesset is elected in a legislative election, then whoever ends up on top and whoever is the plurality party in terms of the seats, they have to form a coalition with other parties, and they have to get enough parties so that they have a total of 61 seats, which is of course needed for a simple majority. And they're only just given around a month or so to do this. In this case, the Likud party, which Benjamin Netanyahu Netanyahu represents was the highest rated party in the 2021 election. So they had to form a coalition with all of these other parties, or some of these parties, to make 61 seats. And since 1 month had passed and the Likud party failed to do that, Benjamin Netanyahu is not the prime minister, and essentially the Likud party is not able to form a government. So in the event that the majority party or the plurality party is not able to form a government, that kind of responsibility transfers to the opposition party, the second highest rated party, which is in this case the Yesh Atid party, which is a center party. The Likud party is a right-wing populist party. So the Yesh Atid currently is responsible for forming a government, and they have up to around early June to get the government in place. And if the Yesh Atid party is not able to do that, then Israel holds another election, and that vote right there is the reason why Israel has had 4 elections in 2 years. They had one starting in 2019, April 2019. They had an election where the Likud party won, and they were not able to form a coalition, and the Blue and White party was not able to form a coalition either. So they had to go into another election, and then this process happened over and over and over again. So we might see the same thing by the end of June, but for now, the Yesh Atid has to break this trend by coalescing around other parties. Now, how does this relate to Benjamin Netanyahu, who wants to escalate tensions between Israel and Palestine? It involves the idea that the Yesh Atid party is not able to form a coalition, which is a very real kind of possibility. So in that instance, it would go to another election, and if Benjamin Netanyahu is able to get Israel to rally around the Likud party, then he could potentially take enough seats from the Yesh Atid party to form some kind of coalition with another right-wing or another nationalist party, and that would ultimately give enough seats for him to continue to be prime minister of Israel. And that is something that could possibly happen, and the Israeli opposition has realized this. The Yesh Atid party has realized this, and they essentially are now blaming Israel for they're essentially blaming Netanyahu for purposefully escalating violence and for starting to start a war against Palestine for the sake of political gain. And that may resonate with Israeli voters, but we have to see what the Yesh Atid does in terms of forming a new government before those kinds of assumptions could be made. So what is the solution to this? The solution to this does not come from the United States. It does not come from any country, any global superpower. It does not come from the United Nations, but instead from Israel and Palestine themselves. Ultimately, Israelis and Palestinians are the people who are damaged and who have to suffer the most from this kind of conflict. It's not the United States who has to suffer. It's not even the Israeli or Palestinian governments who have to suffer, but it's the Palestinians and Israelis themselves who have to hear air sirens every single day, who have to hear bombs explode, who have to face the fresh news that one of their loved ones might have been dead. So it's ultimately up to them. Now, in terms of solution by the Israeli government, there is a niche solution which the Yesh Atid could do. Right now, they are in charge of forming a coalition, and if they try to form with all the left-wing coalitions, which they're most likely going to try to do, that's not enough for 61 seats. That said, if they try to form a coalition with left-wing parties and as well as Arabian parties, the parties that are more favorable to Arab causes like the Shas party and the Ram party, then they will have a majority in order to become the leader of the leading party until the next legislative election. So the reason why that's a solution is because while it's symbolic, it brings a big message to Israelis and Palestinians that ultimately Israelis and Arabs will have to Now, ultimately, Jewish and Arabs will have to work with each other and have to debate peacefully without any kind of violence in order to solve this kind of conflict. If the Yesh Atid is able to do that with the Ram party by combining together, then they're able to, then that sends a message to Palestinians saying that that Israel is ready to negotiate, and that ultimately the solution should come from a compromise, from a peaceful compromise rather than a violent war. So those are the solutions. That's all the context, and it's going to become even more complex than this. It's a kumbaya kind of solution, but it's the nicest and most efficient kind of solution that could come to this everlasting conflict. So that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. This video is now adjourned, and I'll see you in the next one.